My name is Juniper, and on my sister's 30th birthday, I finally realized I was nothing more than a ghost in my own home. We were standing in the grand ballroom of our Malibu estate, surrounded by 200 of the wealthiest people in California, when the music suddenly stopped. My sister Briar stepped toward me with a smirk that should have been a warning, holding a massive 6-tier vanilla cream cake. Without a word, she lunged forward, smashing the heavy confection directly into my face in front of every business associate my father ever wanted to impress. The cold frosting burned my eyes and clogged my nose as I heard her sharp metallic laugh echoing through the silence of the room. "At least now you're worth looking at, Juniper." Briar sneered, wiping a smudge of cream off her designer sleeve, as if I were a piece of trash she had just stepped on. I stood there shivering while my mother Antoinette began to clap enthusiastically, her eyes gleaming with a twisted sort of pride. My father Marshall didn't move to help me. Instead, he adjusted his tie and addressed the guests with a chilling indifference. "She has no real value to this family, just a prop at my table to make the rest of us look better," he declared, his voice booming through the speakers. I felt the wet weight of the cake sliding down my silk dress, but beneath the humiliation, my hand was gripped firmly around a black envelope in my pocket. Before I show you how I turned that house into their prison, please subscribe and share your story if you've ever felt like a shadow in your own family. The cruelty didn't start with that cake. It had been smoldering since the days I was a child, living in the suffocating shadow of my older sister. As a child, I quickly learned that my existence was conditional, based entirely on how much I could facilitate Briar's happiness and bolster our family's public image. While my mother Antoinette spent thousands on pageant dresses and private coaching for her favorite daughter, I was given hand-me-downs that were often 2 sizes too large and stained at the collars. I remember sitting in the corner of the living room sketching intricate floor plans on scrap paper, while Briar practiced her model walk, only for my father Marshall to walk past and step on my drawings without a glance. If I achieved a perfect score on a math test, it was ignored because Briar had just received a minor compliment from a local photographer. My role was to be the invisible laborer, the one who cleaned Briar's room before her friends arrived, and the one who did her homework, so she wouldn't stress her beautiful mind. Antoinette would often remind me that my only purpose was to ensure Briar looked her best, as if I were merely a shadow cast by her brilliant light. One afternoon, I spent weeks building a scale model for a national architecture competition, pouring every ounce of my soul into the balsa wood structure. Briar walked into my room with a lit candle, claiming she wanted to add some dramatic lighting for a photo, and watched with a grin as the model went up in flames. When I screamed in agony, Antoinette rushed in and slapped my face, telling me I was being selfish for upsetting her star child over a silly hobby. Marshall stood in the doorway, his eyes cold as he remarked that a girl with my plain features should focus on being useful rather than creative. He even suggested I should give up on college to work as Briar's full-time assistant. That was the moment I realized that love was a currency I would never possess in that house, so I began to cultivate something much more powerful: silence. I stopped asking for permission, stopped seeking their praise, and started funneling my energy into a secret academic life that they were too self-absorbed to notice. I spent my nights studying by the dim light of my phone, earning a scholarship that would be my ticket out of that hellhole. I realized that if I was going to be a prop, I would be a prop made of reinforced steel, waiting for the right moment to collapse the entire structure. I spent my teenage years observing their financial habits, noting how Marshall's ego drove him into risky investments, while Antoinette's obsession with social standing drained their liquid assets. I watched them sign documents they didn't read and spend money they hadn't earned. I knew their empire was a house of cards held together by the very arrogance that made them treat me like dirt. I didn't fight back then because I wasn't ready to win, but I was documenting every insult, every slap, and every cent they wasted on their gilded illusions. I was an architect even then, not of buildings, but of a slow-burning, inescapable revenge. 3 years after I secretly left that Malibu mansion with nothing but a backpack and a burning resentment, I began carving out an empire under a name they didn't recognize. I moved to the East Coast working 3 different jobs during the day while finishing my master's degree in urban planning and investment at night. The transition from a discarded daughter to J.R. Sterling wasn't a stroke of luck. It was a brutal apprenticeship in the coldest corners of the American financial system. I remember spending nights in public libraries studying tax codes and corporate law until the janitors flicked the lights, all while my stomach growled from a diet of tap water and stale bread. I lived in a basement apartment in Brooklyn where the heat barely worked, but the cold only made my resolve harder. I intentionally chose a gender-neutral pseudonym because I knew that in the high-stakes world of venture capital, a woman with my background would be scrutinized twice, and I needed my intellect to be a silent predator. Meanwhile, back in Malibu, the cracks in the family foundation were becoming craters as Briar's attempted fashion line collapsed under her own incompetence. She had spent millions on silk and influencers, but she didn't know the first thing about supply chains or overhead. I heard through the grapevine that Marshall had lost a significant portion of the family trust in a failed real estate venture in Dubai, but they continued to host lavish parties to maintain the facade of wealth. Under my professional pseudonym, I began making high-risk moves in the venture capital world, eventually becoming a partner at a firm that specialized in distressed assets. It was during this time that my best friend Skylar became my eyes and ears inside the social circles my parents still desperately clung to. Skylar would call me with updates on their desperation, telling me how Antoinette was secretly selling her jewelry to pay the staff while Briar continued to buy $1,000 shoes on credit. Skylar was the only one who knew the truth, the only one who saw the girl behind the corporate mask. One evening, Skylar sent me tax documents she had managed to obtain through her job at the bank, revealing that Marshall was on the verge of being indicted for financial fraud. He was using his investors' money to pay for Briar's vanity projects. I brokered my first major deal in a basement office, persuading a group of cynical investors to back a failing firm that everyone else had written off as a lost cause. When that deal yielded a massive return, the industry started whispering about my reputation, never imagining the power was held by a girl they had once dismissed. I started a shell company called Apex Holdings and began quietly purchasing the predatory loans Marshall had taken out to keep the estate. Every time he signed a new agreement to cover his old debts, he was unknowingly signing over another piece of his soul to the daughter he had called worthless. I worked until my eyes bled, building a reputation as a ruthless closer in the industry, all while keeping my true identity hidden from the very people who shared my DNA. 9 months before the fateful gala, Marshall called me for the first time in years with a tone of voice that was uncharacteristically hesitant and weak. He didn't ask how I was or where I had been. He simply told me that the family was facing a temporary liquidity issue, and that as a daughter, it was my duty to step up. He sounded like a man who had forgotten he had spent 20 years stepping on me. I sat in my high-rise office in Manhattan, swirling a glass of expensive scotch, listening to the man who once stepped on my drawings beg for a $5 million lifeline. I agreed to provide the funding through Apex Holdings, but I insisted on a personal guarantee contract that was so complex, his desperate lawyers didn't even catch the moral turpitude clause I had hidden in the fine print. This clause was a legal masterpiece. It stated that any public act of harassment or disparagement against the lender's representative would trigger an immediate foreclosure on all secured assets. It was a trap built on their own arrogance. I flew back to California pretending to be the same submissive Juniper they remembered letting Antoinette criticize my cheap clothes while I handed over the checks. She actually told me I looked homely as she took $1 million wire transfer from my company. Briar was the worst, mocking me for being a boring office drone, while she used my money to plan the most expensive 30th birthday party Malibu had ever seen. She even had the audacity to ask me to be her personal assistant for the event, claiming I was the only one she could trust with the menial tasks. She wanted me to coordinate the florist, the caterers, and the security, all while she took the credit. I accepted the role with a polite nod, knowing that every flower arrangement and bottle of champagne she ordered was being paid for with a loan she could never repay. Mom believed I had finally come to my senses, thinking that my willingness to help was a sign that I was desperate for their approval again. It was pathetic to watch her perform the role of a loving mother only when she needed my signature on a bank document. She would tell the guests that I was finding myself through service to the family. Skylar met me at a local coffee shop a week before the event, handing me a final flash drive containing Briar's internal emails, where she joked about milking me for every cent before throwing me back to the streets. "She thinks you're her personal piggy bank, Juniper," Skylar warned me. I reviewed the security footage of the estate, ensuring my legal team had full access to the ballroom's audiovisual system for the big night. I spent those final days in a state of calm focus, watching them spend money they didn't have to impress people who didn't like them. Julian, my lead counsel, confirmed that all the trapdoors were set, and the legal triggers were primed for action. I let Briar scream at me about the temperature of the champagne, and I let Marshall lecture me about the importance of family loyalty, knowing their words would soon be used against them in a court of law. I wasn't just helping them. I was financing the grandest stage for their ultimate humiliation. The night of the gala unfolded under the soft glow of golden lanterns, but for me, it felt like the final act of a long-awaited play. The Malibu estate was draped in silk and gold, with the ocean breeze carrying the scent of expensive perfume and the underlying rot of a dying empire. Briar was in her element, wearing a dress that cost more than a year's salary for most people, while I moved through the crowd in the background, fulfilling my role as the useful prop. I wore a simple black dress invisible among the peacocks. As the clock struck 9, the lights dimmed for the main event, and Briar called me to the center of the ballroom to present her with the massive birthday cake. I walked forward, holding the heavy tray, my heart beating with a cold, steady rhythm that felt like a countdown to their destruction. Suddenly, Briar made it look like I tripped, and in the chaos she grabbed the cake and smashed it into my face with a violence that shocked the room. The guests gasped, but then, led by Antoinette's cruel laughter, a wave of chuckles spread through the crowd as I stood there humiliated and dripping with vanilla frosting. Briar leaned in close and hissed the words that would be her last. "At least now you're worth looking at, Juniper. You finally have some flavor." Dad stepped up to the microphone, not to apologize, but to use the moment to further assert his dominance over me. "My daughter Briar is the star of this family, while Juniper is just a prop at my table, a necessary eyesore to remind us of our own greatness." Marshall said, his voice booming through the speakers, dripping with condescension. I didn't run away and I didn't scream. I simply reached out and took a silk napkin from a nearby table, slowly wiping the frosting from my eyes. I looked toward the back of the room where Julian was standing with a tablet in his hand, and I gave him a single slight nod. The giant projector screen behind the stage, which was supposed to show a tribute video to Briar, suddenly flickered and changed. Instead of photos of her modeling, it displayed the moral turpitude clause of the Apex Holdings contract highlighted in bright red. The room went dead silent as the guests began to read the legal language that essentially stated my family had just signed away their lives. I walked over to the microphone, my voice calm and unwavering, and addressed the 200 people who had just been laughing at me. "The contract is clear," I said, my eyes locking onto Marshall's. "Any act of public disparagement triggers immediate foreclosure, and you just gave the most public performance of your life." I stood there covered in vanilla frosting, yet I had never felt more powerful in my entire life. I watched the realization dawn on Marshall's face as the logo for Apex Holdings appeared on the screen, revealing that the faceless corporation he feared was the daughter he had just insulted. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the sound of Antoinette dropping her glass. I did not shed a single tear as I stood on that stage. Instead, I felt a surge of cold clarity that I had been preparing for over a decade. I stood tall on the stage, the white cream still matting my hair, but my presence was so commanding that no one dared to utter a word. As of 10 minutes ago, Apex Holdings has triggered the immediate foreclosure of the Malibu estate and every asset owned by Marshall and Antoinette. I announced, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. I pointed to the screen, where the signature on the loan documents clearly showed Marshall's desperate handwriting next to my corporate seal. Briar lunged at me, screaming that I was a liar and a nobody. But Julian stepped forward with security guards and blocked her path with professional efficiency. "Julian, please serve the official papers," I said, and watched as my lawyer handed a thick stack of legal documents to my father, whose hands were shaking so violently he dropped the papers onto the frosting-covered floor. Antoinette began to wail a high-pitched, pathetic sound that lacked any of the grace she had practiced for decades as she realized I was now her landlord. I informed the guests that the party was officially over and that the catering was being canceled effective immediately. "You have 30 minutes to vacate the premises before the locks are changed," I told my parents and sister, who were frozen in a state of absolute shock. Marshall tried to argue, claiming the contract wasn't valid, but Julian calmly reminded him that the entire incident had been captured by the ballroom's high-definition cameras. The guests began to scramble for the exits, whispering and pointing at the family that had just fallen from grace in the most public way possible. They didn't want to be associated with losers. Marshall tried to grab my arm, begging me to think about our reputation, but I pulled away with a look of pure disgust. I told him that he was the one who taught me that I had no value, so he shouldn't be surprised when I applied that logic to him. "You wanted a prop, Dad," I whispered so only he could hear. "But you forgot that even a prop can be used to set the stage for a massacre. You're not a businessman, you're just a bully who ran out of lunch money." Briar was on the floor, her expensive dress ruined by the very cake she had smashed into my face, sobbing about her brand and her future. I didn't feel a shred of pity for her. I only felt the immense weight of 28 years of abuse finally lifting off my shoulders. I watched the local police enter the ballroom to oversee the eviction, ensuring their downfall would be the lead story on the morning news. The humiliation they had planned for me had become the very fire that consumed their entire world. I walked out of that house without looking back, leaving them to deal with the ruins of a life built on lies. The following morning, as the tabloid headlines began to scream about the Malibu meltdown, I sat in my quiet office watching the fallout from a distance. The fall of the Malibu dynasty was swift and merciless, exactly as I had planned it during those long, lonely nights on the East Coast. Marshall was taken in for questioning by the SEC within 48 hours, as the records I provided proved he had been using company funds to pay for Antoinette's lavish lifestyle. It turns out embezzling from your own firm to buy your wife a yacht is frowned upon by federal investigators. The legal fallout in the United States is a slow grinding machine that strips away your dignity layer by layer, and I made sure they felt every vibration of that machine. My legal team coordinated with the district attorney to ensure that the evidence of Marshall's shell companies was undeniable, leading to a freeze on all his offshore accounts. Antoinette was forced to move into a cramped one-bedroom apartment in a part of town she used to mock her charity friends, having abandoned her the second the money ran out. I watched a viral clip of Antoinette trying to use a canceled credit card at a high-end grocery store, her face contorted in disbelief as the teenage cashier calmly asked her to step aside for paying customers. She looked like a ghost of the woman who used to demand a front-row seat at every fashion show. Briar's downfall was even more digital and permanent, as a group of former employees she had bullied came forward with recorded audio of her verbal abuse, turning her influencer brand into a toxic asset that no agency would touch. In America, when the wealthy fall, they lose their access to the gatekeepers of society, finding themselves blacklisted from every club and board from New York to Los Angeles. I received dozens of frantic voicemails from them, ranging from tearful apologies to venomous threats. But I didn't listen to a single one. I had Julian handle all communications, which were strictly limited to the logistics of their debt repayment and the final sale of their remaining belongings. I decided to put the Malibu estate on the market immediately, but not before I went back one last time to walk through the empty halls. The house felt smaller, colder, and devoid of the terrifying power it once held over me. I stood in the ballroom where the cake incident had happened and realized that the silence I once used as a shield was now a weapon of absolute victory. Skylar met me there, and together we watched as the movers packed up the last of Briar's designer wardrobes to be sold at a public auction. They were finally experiencing the invisibility they had forced upon me for nearly 3 decades, and I found the irony to be the most satisfying part of the entire ordeal. They were no longer the stars of the show. They weren't even the extras. They were just footnotes in my success story. A few months later, I found myself sitting on a quiet porch in a small coastal town in Maine, looking out at the vast, unchanging ocean. I have relocated here to run my own architectural firm that focuses on sustainable housing for those who have lost everything. My name is no longer associated with the Malibu scandal. Instead, it is synonymous with resilience and the kind of success that doesn't need to be shouted from a stage. I spend my mornings walking along the rugged shoreline, breathing in the salt air and listening to the sound of the waves, a stark contrast to the suffocating silence of my childhood. I realized that the greatest revenge wasn't just taking their money or their house, it was becoming a person they could no longer recognize or reach. I am no longer a prop in eyesore or a shadow. I am the designer of my own destiny, and the foundations I've built are unshakable. I learned that you cannot build a future on a foundation of hate, so I let that go too, replacing it with the quiet satisfaction of knowing I survived. To those of you who are still standing in the shadows of a toxic family, wondering if you will ever be enough, I want you to hear this. Your value is not a variable that they get to calculate. They will try to make you feel small so they can feel tall, but their height is an illusion built on your submission. You have the power to stop being a character in their script and start writing your own ending, even if it takes years of silence and struggle to get there. Value yourself first, because if you don't, no one else will. Thank you for listening to my story. If you've ever been treated unfairly, I hope this story gives you some courage. The biggest lesson I want to convey is never let others define your limits, even if they are family. Perseverance and wisdom will always be your most powerful weapons to reclaim justice for yourself. Don't confuse patience with weakness, because sometimes silence is when you're sharpening your weapons for the final comeback. Thank you to everyone who listened until this point. If you see yourself in Juniper's story, don't hesitate to share your thoughts and comments below. Please subscribe so we can spread stories of resilience and justice together.